Brothers and sisters, imagine this. You're standing before the entire world, over 100 nations, waiting for you to bow, to read a carefully written apology that you didn't write and never agreed to. That's exactly what President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso faced. A 12-page document. No signature. No dignity. Just submission disguised as diplomacy. They told him, read it. Apologize. It's how you survive. But Traoré didn't come to New York to survive. He came to speak. And what he said next left the entire United Nations in stunned silence. This isn't just about one leader. It's about a continent. About Africa refusing to kneel. About one man who walked into the lion's den and roared for all of us. So if you believe that Africa should never have to apologize for speaking the truth, if you believe dignity is not negotiable, then subscribe now. Because this is the story the media never wanted you to hear. Before we take you inside that unforgettable moment, let me show you the world behind the speech, the threats, the betrayal, the moment a midnight phone call changed everything, and the courage of one man to fold up their script and write his own. Because what happened that week didn't just shake the United Nations. It shook the very idea of who gets to speak and who is forced to stay silent. But who tried to silence him and why? That's where this story truly begins. The week before the speech, the pressure was suffocating. It didn't start with cameras or microphones. It started with a piece of paper. 12 pages, written by anonymous hands. No names, no accountability, just demands. It was sent directly to the office of President Ibrahim Traoré with a note from the United Nations. Read this at the General Assembly. Clarify your position. Protect diplomatic partnerships. But buried between the lines was the real message. Apologize or be punished. It was more than a speech. It was a carefully scripted confession, written not to bring peace, but to maintain control. 4 pages apologizing for tone, 3 pages for language, and 5 pages reaffirming shared values. Whose values? Certainly not Burkina Faso's. Traoré didn't speak immediately. He listened. He watched. Then he made a decision. This would not be read. Because this wasn't about clarifying. It was about surrendering. 3 days later, at 2 a.m., Traoré's personal phone rang, the one only 5 people on Earth had access to. A voice on the line said, "President Traoré, this is Ambassador Richardson from the U.S. State Department. We need to talk." 20 minutes later, an unmarked black SUV pulled up to the presidential palace. No flags, no warning. Inside was Richardson and 2 unnamed men. He opened a leather briefcase and laid out satellite images of Burkina Faso's gold mines, financial records of recent infrastructure deals with China, and intelligence files on Russian advisors that had never been publicly acknowledged. "We know everything," Richardson said. "And right now, we're calling it economic cooperation. But that could change." It was a veiled threat, delivered with a smile. But Traoré didn't flinch. He knew this was more than diplomacy. It was leverage, pure and simple. For the last 6 months, Burkina Faso had been quietly restructuring its international relationships, moving away from dependence on Western powers. Chinese engineers were rebuilding telecom networks. Russian experts were revitalizing agriculture. Iranian firms were setting up local pharmaceutical plants, not because they hated the West, but because they had learned. Dependence is just slavery with nicer branding. Still, the pressure grew. State Department officials followed up. Back channels were activated. Offers were made. Sanctions were hinted at. But the final blow came in the form of that apology script. It was clear now, they weren't asking, they were demanding. It was a direct challenge to Traoré's authority and to the dignity of his nation. Instead of responding, he called a meeting with his security chief. "How many Western intelligence operatives are under surveillance in Ouagadougou?" he asked. 17 confirmed. Possibly double that. "And how many of our lines are they monitoring?" "All of them. But we've been feeding them false intel for 3 months. Traoré smiled. "Good. Tomorrow, leak a story that I'm reconsidering the speech. Make them think I'll read their apology." His chief nodded. "Understood, Mr. President." What followed was one of the most sophisticated psychological counterstrikes in modern African diplomacy. By the next morning, Western embassies were buzzing. Reports claimed that Traoré was softening his stance. CNN ran a story, "Burkina Faso President May Walk Back Remarks." The BBC quoted diplomatic insiders saying Traoré was open to compromise. In Washington, officials quietly celebrated. They believed their pressure campaign had worked. But while they celebrated in air-conditioned boardrooms, Traoré stood before 50,000 citizens in Revolution Square. "They think we will apologize," he told the crowd. "They think Africa still begs for permission to speak." The roar that followed could be heard for miles. Mothers held their children high. Veterans saluted. Students raised their fists. "When I stand before the United Nations," he said, "I will not just speak for Burkina Faso, I will speak for every African who was ever told to be quiet." That moment wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. While the West believed he was bending, Traoré was rallying his people, preparing them emotionally, politically, spiritually, and more importantly, he was sending a message. The script they wrote would never be spoken. Not by him, not on that stage. But what made him so certain? What gave him the resolve to resist threats, pressure, and isolation? That's the real story, the one hidden beneath the headlines. It wasn't just political strategy, it was something deeper, something personal, because Traoré knew that this wasn't about him. It was about history, about reversing centuries of silence. But what happened when he finally stood before that microphone? What did he say that left the chamber speechless? The chamber at the United Nations was unusually quiet that day. Delegates from over 100 countries sat poised, their faces a mixture of expectation, skepticism, and silent calculation. Some expected a man humbled by pressure. Others anticipated a carefully worded compromise. But when President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso walked up to the microphone, he carried no papers, no notes, just a calm, unwavering gaze that scanned the room like a man who knew exactly what he came to do. He adjusted the mic once. No apology, no preamble, just a question. "Before you ask me to apologize, let me ask you something. How many times have you apologized for what you've done to Africa?" The silence that followed was thick, nearly tangible. He didn't wait for an answer. Did Belgium ever apologize for the Congo? Did France ever apologize for massacres in Algeria? Did Israel ever apologize for training militias that destabilized our region? Gasps, uneasy shifting in chairs. Some delegates lowered their eyes. The French representative stood and walked out. But Traoré was only warming up. He continued, "You accuse me of inciting hatred because I spoke the truth. But when bombs fall on Gaza, you call it defense. When African children starve under your trade policies, you call it economics. When we rise, you panic." Each sentence landed like a blow, not just politically, but morally. For many in the room, this wasn't a speech. It was an indictment. But he wasn't done. He pulled out his phone. The gesture itself was shocking. It shattered the formality of the setting. "This," he said, "is a message I received this morning from a 12-year-old girl in Ouagadougou." The room froze. He read it aloud. Mr. President, my teacher says you're going to America to speak for us. Please don't let them make you small. We are proud to be African. When he looked up from the screen, his voice didn't waver. That child, he said slowly, has more dignity than this entire assembly. You could hear a pin drop. Cameras zoomed in. Note-takers stopped writing. Even the translators in their booths paused. It was clear this was not a prepared statement. This was raw, unfiltered conviction. And then came the moment no one expected. I will apologize, he said. Murmurs rippled across the room. He let the moment hang before continuing. I apologize that it took this long for an African leader to stand in this chamber and speak without fear. He paused again. I apologize that my predecessors believed they had to choose between sovereignty and survival. I apologize that our children grew up believing they needed your approval to dream. And then the tone shifted. Stronger. Sharper. But I will not apologize for refusing occupation disguised as diplomacy. I will not apologize for rejecting partnerships that leave my people in poverty. I will not apologize for being African and proud. He looked each delegate in the eye. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then you are finally beginning to understand how we felt for centuries. The speech lasted less than 15 minutes. There was no applause, no standing ovation, just stunned silence. But the message had landed, and it had shaken the foundation of global diplomacy. 3 hours later, something unprecedented happened. The African Union called an emergency session. 43 African ambassadors gathered at the Ethiopian mission to the UN. For the first time in decades, they weren't discussing aid packages or trade agreements. They were discussing something far more powerful, dignity. The result? The New York Declaration, a bold commitment that no African nation would apologize for defending its sovereignty or accept foreign aid that came with political strings attached. Within 48 hours, 12 African presidents had signed it. But the real explosion wasn't happening in conference rooms. It was happening in the streets. In Lagos, market women began refusing to sell goods from companies that supported foreign military action. In Nairobi, students organized Dignity Day, a campus-wide event teaching political self-determination. In Cape Town, murals of African leaders from Nkrumah to Mandela to Traoré began appearing overnight, tagged with 3 words, "No apology given." And in Harlem, a mural went up the very next day, Traoré's silhouette, a map of Africa behind him, and painted in bold red letters, "He speaks for us." But if the streets were erupting with solidarity, the halls of power in the West were starting to tremble. Retaliation was swift. The European Union froze $27 million in aid. The IMF postponed a key debt relief package. Think tanks labeled Traoré a dangerous populist. Western media launched a smear campaign. Yet the more they pushed back, the more the movement grew. Not because of defiance alone, but because of something even more dangerous to the old order: competence. And now, the question that began to haunt the corridors of Washington, Paris, and Brussels. What happens if the rest of Africa follows Traoré's lead? The days that followed Traoré's speech felt like aftershocks of an earthquake, unseen but deeply felt. In Burkina Faso, something profound began to stir, not in parliament halls or press conferences, but in the streets, the farms, and the homes of ordinary people. It wasn't protest. It wasn't rebellion. It was resolve. For decades, the average Burkinabe citizen had lived with the quiet weight of foreign dependence on food imports, medical aid, development loans, and approval from distant capitals. That weight suddenly felt lighter, not because the pressure vanished, but because something deeper shifted. Belief. At first it was subtle. A group of university students canceled a planned protest and instead hosted a community dialogue about sovereignty and economic independence. Dozens of young engineers who had considered leaving for Europe decided to stay and build instead. Then it became visible. Hundreds of men and women gathered in Revolution Square, not to demand change, but to offer labor. They came with shovels, buckets, and hammers, volunteering to rebuild schools and irrigation canals with nothing but local tools. And then it became measurable. Within 6 months, Burkina Faso had reached full food security, an achievement no one thought possible without foreign aid. But it didn't come from high-tech imports or billion-dollar grants. It came from Burkina farmers returning to ancestral methods, planting indigenous crops suited to local soil, harvesting according to lunar patterns, using irrigation strategies passed down through generations. The so-called primitive techniques that foreign experts once mocked turned out to be perfectly tailored to the land. Traoré's speech had not just shifted global perception, it had reshaped domestic priorities. Ministries were restructured. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs rebranded itself as the Ministry of Sovereign Partnerships. A new Office of Indigenous Innovation was created to prioritize local solutions over imported ones. Budget lines that once went to international consultants were redirected to local cooperatives. Foreign NGOs, once seen as saviors, were now required to register under new transparency laws and submit to local oversight committees. The change wasn't about isolation. It was about recalibration, about deciding who gets to lead development, outsiders, or the people living the reality every day. But not all change was peaceful. There were internal tremors, too. Members of the old elite, those who had benefited from foreign contracts, backdoor deals, and diplomatic immunity, began to resist. Leaked emails revealed attempts to undermine the administration through media influence and economic sabotage. One former minister even attempted to flee the country with classified documents and was apprehended at the border. Still, the government didn't respond with purges or paranoia. Instead, it doubled down on transparency. Every major contract was published online. Weekly town hall broadcasts allowed citizens to ask unfiltered questions to ministers. Trust was no longer a campaign promise, it became policy. Among the most moving symbols of this shift was a grandmother named Aissata. She appeared on national television holding her grandson in one arm and a small worn book in the other. "I never learned to read," she said softly, "but I know what dignity looks like, and today I see it in my grandson's eyes." That single clip went viral, not because of what she said, but because of what she represented. Generations of quiet strength finally stepping into the light. Politically, the ripple effects were undeniable. Opposition parties that had once criticized Traoré for being too radical now found themselves echoing his message, not because they had changed their minds, but because the people had. Opinion polls showed a 76% increase in public confidence toward the government. More significantly, a new metric began to emerge. Community participation. Across the country, volunteer rates tripled. Local councils reported record attendance. One village in the eastern province passed a resolution declaring that no external donor could dictate school curricula without approval from parents and elders. It wasn't nationalism, it was empowerment. But with empowerment came attention. International watchdogs began circling. Western media outlets published editorials warning of populist authoritarianism and dangerous isolationism. The United Nations quietly suspended funding for 2 humanitarian programs, citing concerns over governance structure. And behind the scenes, diplomatic cables revealed discussions of potential sanctions. Yet inside Burkina Faso, there was no panic. Traoré had warned them, independence has a cost. But for once, the people were willing to pay it. And then a question began to surface, spoken first in whispers, then out loud. How would the United States respond? Not with statements or sound bites, but with policy? Because if one nation could break free, what stopped others from following? From Washington to Brussels, Traoré's speech sent tremors through the foundations of foreign policy. In official press briefings, Western leaders remained composed. Statements were measured, polite, almost dismissive. The U.S. State Department issued a short memo reaffirming its commitment to dialogue and shared democratic values. France called for restraint and responsibility. But behind closed doors, the reaction was far from calm. Leaked intelligence memos revealed just how seriously the West took what had happened. A classified document from the U.S. State Department, later leaked to a journalist in Nairobi, was titled African Leadership Assessment, Post-Traoré Implications. It was 12 pages of quiet panic. One line stood out. The Burkina Faso model represents a fundamental threat to Western influence in sub-Saharan Africa. If replicated, traditional leverage mechanisms will be ineffective within 5 years. It wasn't just what Traoré had said, it was how he said it. With composure, clarity, and credibility. He didn't just call out the West. He exposed its playbook, and that terrified policymakers. For decades, influence had been maintained not through direct force, but through economic dependencies, security partnerships, and soft power narratives. Traoré had walked into the world's most controlled environment and dismantled all 3 in under 15 minutes. In Washington, think tanks scrambled. Op-eds flooded major newspapers, warning of a new wave of African assertiveness. One editorial in Foreign Affairs called Traoré a charismatic disruptor who could reset the balance of power in the global South. The Wall Street Journal asked, is Burkina Faso leading Africa into economic isolation or into self-reliance? But it wasn't just questions being asked, it was actions being taken. Within 72 hours of the speech, the European Union announced a freeze on $27 million in development aid to Burkina Faso. The IMF postponed a critical debt relief review. Western banks quietly flagged Burkina Faso for high geopolitical risk, slowing down international transactions. French media launched a coordinated campaign, labeling Traoré a nationalist strongman, drawing comparisons to historical figures whose names evoked instability. But the most calculated response came from the intelligence community. According to multiple sources, Western agencies increased surveillance across West Africa. Reports showed a spike in digital monitoring of journalists, student groups, and grassroots organizations that had praised Traoré's speech. In at least 3 African countries, Western diplomats met with local opposition leaders behind closed doors. Discussions labeled as routine, but widely suspected to be part of a containment strategy. Meanwhile, embassy staff in key capitals were instructed to monitor populist rhetoric and track its spread on social media. And yet, despite the warnings, the movement continued to grow. Not just in Burkina Faso, not just in Africa, but globally. In Jamaica, radio hosts played Traoré's speech in full, followed by discussions on Caribbean sovereignty. In Brazil, Afro-Brazilian activists cited his words during protests against foreign land ownership in the Amazon. In Australia, Aboriginal leaders referenced the speech in their calls for treaty renegotiations with the government. Indigenous communities in Canada began organizing teach-ins under the banner, "No Apology Given." The Global South was no longer waiting for permission to speak. It was speaking loudly. What alarmed policymakers most wasn't the rhetoric, it was the organization. Because the response wasn't chaotic, it was disciplined, focused, and rooted in a new kind of confidence. That confidence wasn't manufactured by Western consultants or foreign-funded NGOs. It was grown from within. It was local, authentic, and impossible to control. Back in Washington, internal divisions began to show. Some advisors called for strategic engagement, proposing quiet negotiations with Traoré's government to stabilize relations. Others pushed for harder tactics, sanctions, visa restrictions, intelligence campaigns. The Pentagon reportedly conducted a strategic review of its Sahel operations, concerned that growing anti-Western sentiment could compromise regional bases. A senior official, speaking off the record, summed it up plainly. "We've lost the narrative. And when you lose the narrative in Africa, you lose the ground beneath your feet." But why did one speech matter so much? Because it wasn't just words. It revealed the fragility of an entire system. One built on the assumption that African leaders would always play along, always seek approval, always bend when pressured. Traoré didn't bend. He broke the mold. And in doing so, he exposed the West's greatest vulnerability, the illusion of control. And now, a question loomed not just over Washington, but over every capital that had built its influence on compliance. What happens when Africa stops asking for permission to understand the true weight of Ibrahim Traoré's speech? You have to look backward. Decades, even centuries. His defiance wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't a viral stunt designed for applause. It was the latest chapter in a long, unfinished book written by African leaders who chose resistance over submission. In many ways, it echoed the voice of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary former president of Burkina Faso, who once said, "He who feeds you controls you." Sankara, too, had rejected foreign dependency, championed self-reliance, and paid the ultimate price for it. But this time, history didn't repeat, it advanced. Traoré's words stood on the shoulders of giants. Kwame Nkrumah, who envisioned a continent united not by language or geography, but by purpose. Patrice Lumumba, who was murdered for saying Congo would belong to Congolese. Steve Biko, who reminded South Africans that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Even Cheikh Anta Diop, the Senegalese historian, whose research exposed the Eurocentric distortion of Africa's intellectual legacy, would have recognized in Traoré's speech a revival of cultural memory long suppressed. But unlike these predecessors, Traoré had an audience beyond the room. His voice was streamed in real time and echoed through phones, radios, and minds across Africa and the diaspora. The timing wasn't just symbolic, it was historic. And yet, for all the praise, the message was radical in its simplicity. Dignity is not negotiable. Traoré didn't call for war. He didn't demand reparations. He demanded memory. Memory of who Africans were before colonization, before borders were carved in Berlin, before treaties were signed that prioritized minerals over mothers. His speech reminded the world that Africa's deepest wound was not poverty. It was dismembered identity, a forced forgetting, a cultivated belief that greatness must be imported. but memory has a pulse. And that pulse began to throb. In Ghana, a mural of Traoré appeared beside Nkrumah and Sankara under the words, "The Unbroken Chain." In Nigeria, university students launched a series of public lectures titled Reclaiming the Legacy, juxtaposing Traoré's words with anti-colonial manifestos from the 20th century. In Senegal, a theater company debuted a play called The Apology That Never Came, reenacting speeches from African leaders who died before they were heard. In Haiti, the Ministry of Culture organized a week-long commemoration linking Traoré's address to Haiti's revolution, the world's first successful Black republic. The symbolism was overwhelming. In a time of global instability, an African president had become the continent's moral compass, not through wealth, not through weaponry, but through truth. This awakening wasn't academic, it was generational. Elders who had once fought colonial regimes, like the man who handed Traoré the original Burkina flag, felt seen again, and youth who had grown up thinking their future depended on scholarships from Europe or grants from the IMF were hearing something new. Build here. Stay. Be proud. Grow your roots deep. That shift wasn't subtle, it was seismic. Because what Traoré ignited wasn't just resistance, it was replacement. A replacement of inferiority with agency, of hesitation with conviction. The media often fails to grasp this kind of revolution. It's not loud. It doesn't march with banners. It happens when a grandmother tells her granddaughter, "You don't have to change your name to be respected." It happens when a young man in Nairobi turns down a foreign job offer because he wants to build something that lasts in his own village. It happens when farmers reject imported seeds and return to ancestral soil wisdom and double their harvests. These are not acts of nostalgia. They are acts of clarity. Scholars in South Africa have already called Traoré's address the most consequential African speech since Mandela's inauguration. In Jamaica, poets are setting his words to rhythm. In Brazil, teachers are assigning the transcript as required reading in Afro-Brazilian studies. And in the United States, Black pastors are quoting him in sermons, not because he's African, but because he is unapologetically so. The global Black imagination has found a reference point not in sports or entertainment or struggle, but in statesmanship. Perhaps that's what shook the West the most. Traoré didn't just speak with fire. He spoke with facts, with poise, with a depth of historical consciousness that shattered stereotypes of African incompetence. He didn't ask for sympathy. He demanded respect. And in doing so, he reminded every power broker in the world that the days of Africa being lectured were coming to an end. The age of Africa speaking for itself, firmly, fluently, and freely, had begun. And now, one question remains unanswered, quietly haunting those still clinging to old hierarchies. What if Africa never forgets who it was ever again? The most dangerous revolutions are not fought with guns. They're fought with ideas. And what began in that chamber at the United Nations was not a policy disagreement. It was a fracture in the world order. A single African leader stood, spoke without fear, and refused to apologize. That moment triggered something bigger than anyone had predicted. And now, the question haunting every capital from Paris to Washington is this: can they stop what comes next? Because what followed wasn't protest, it was purpose. African youth stopped begging for opportunity and began building it. Elders who once felt forgotten became living bridges between generations. Governments that once waited for Western validation started writing their own strategies. The ripple became a wave, and now that wave is reaching other shores. In Latin America, indigenous leaders are quoting Traoré in their land sovereignty campaigns. In the Pacific, island nations facing climate betrayal are using his language to demand justice. In Asia, former colonies are revisiting debt deals, no longer afraid to walk away from assistance that comes with invisible chains. What began in Ouagadougou may very well become the blueprint for a post-colonial world, one not dictated by approval ratings in foreign capitals, but by dignity defined at home. But not everyone welcomes this awakening. Sanctions are tightening. Media narratives are shifting. Backroom deals are being drafted to isolate Burkina Faso and any nation that dares follow its path. And yet, the fire lit in that speech continues to spread, not because of a man, but because of a message. We do not need permission to exist in full voice. So now, dear listener, I ask you, is this the beginning of Africa's rise, or the beginning of a new global confrontation? Will the world allow a continent long silenced to finally speak on its own terms? Or will it resort to the oldest tactic in the book, divide, suppress, and erase? But maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe the real power lies not in how the world responds, but in how Africans remember. And now they remember. They remember what it means to walk tall, to speak clearly, to look oppression in the face and say, "No more." And if you're hearing this and your heart is stirred, if you believe that truth, dignity, and freedom still matter, then join us. Share this story. Let others hear it. Not because it flatters, but because it challenges. Because it asks the uncomfortable questions. Because it refuses to settle. If this story moved you, if you felt something stirred deep within, then leave a comment. Tell us how it made you feel. Like this video. Share it. And subscribe for more truths they don't want told. Because this platform isn't just about content, it's about conscience. We will be back with the next story, one that continues where this left off, one that digs deeper, one that keeps the fire alive. May God bless you. May He bless the people of Burkina Faso. And may He bless all those across Africa, the Caribbean, and the world who choose dignity over fear, who choose truth over convenience, who choose to stand when the world says kneel, because in the end, freedom isn't granted, it's remembered, and now Africa remembers.